Now, historically, we've grown up with citations of FARC in Peru, FARC in Colombia, Shining Path in Peru, Abu Sayyaf in the Philippines, but they're becoming evidentially dated. So are we speaking of formalized collaborations between organized crime groups and terrorist organizations? Are we talking about an ad hoc relationship or relationships according to circumstances or need? Are we talking about adopting or adapting each other's tactics or routes? Or are we talking about taking advantage of the ground prepared by the other? And I'll argue through as much of this presentation as I get through that's probably all of the above. Now, of course, whilst there's always a danger that having too much context can steal time from subsequent slides on convergence, I think it's important to set the backdrop. Accordingly, just a reminder, as if you didn't know, we live in a globalized world with 24/7 connectivity of transportation, communication and financial systems. A world in which terrorist organizations and organized crime groups operate extraterritorially, and governments and law enforcement agencies, notwithstanding the valiant efforts of the UN, operate within national borders. Getting to the heart of the existence, nature and extent of the convergence between organised crime and terrorism has been configured as a maze without apparent end. The convergence question also sits within the context of a range of interconnected geopolitical, societal and technological risks, each of which have to be analysed in order, but not today, you'll be thankful to know, to reach an holistic overview. So those would include, for those who can't see the screen from here, terrorism, corruption, data fraud and theft, organised crime, illicit trade, fragile states, and global governance failures. The illegal economy created and sustained by organised crime and corruption is formed, influenced and exacerbated by the intersections of state fragility and terrorism you see on the right-hand side. So they have always been connected, it's just that we're drawing more attention to them in recent years. The nature and dynamics of organised crime per se, with which the purported convergence with terrorist groups are driven by a range of networks and expertise. So predominantly organised crime groups, but also importantly flat structured criminal networks and criminal experts who are part of the organised crime machine but sit effectively outside it, accountants, lawyers, bankers, etc. And these groups use well-established and innovative methodologies. And now, so far, document fraud has been a prime focus for terrorist groups trying to recruit lone wolf occupants from a range of Western countries, because they use fraudulent documentation, and sometimes not, sometimes they're real documentation, to obtain credit cards, loans, mortgages, and then simply disappear with the money over to Syria and beyond. And organised crime groups, and also increasingly terrorist groups, access a wide range of transnational crime activity. And again, fraud I've already mentioned, but if you look at the movement of refugees from Syria across the eastern Mediterranean routes into Europe, amongst all those migrant populations, we also have a significantly increased number of smuggled and human trafficked victims. And that's become a major financial wherewithal for a number of terrorist groups in that region. And of course, all of these groups operate within a global market which touches literally every continent, and which creates its own geographical areas of specialism, such as South Asia, which you can see flashing there, and about which we're talking today. Now, it's certainly true that the dynamics of transnational organised crime have evolved. It's no longer the penchant of a few Italian or Japanese or Chinese specialist organisations. They are now an important strategic activity for armed groups globally and a source of funding for terrorists, amongst many others. Transnational crime, of course, amplifies all other security challenges because they have moved their basis of operation transnationally as well. And to do that, they've had to inculcate through massive corruption most state operators, departments, government offices, police officers, customs and so forth. And what we've seen most recently is their systematic targeting of already weak states, therefore making those states vulnerable to predation and to serve as a base not only for international criminal enterprises, but more recently terrorist organizations as well. So we can say that organised crime has a direct impact upon state governance. It erodes those states' ability to build infrastructure over the long term, which is needed for economic recovery. And of course, without capacity, a state becomes fragile very, very quickly. And a state which also has endemic corruption, which of course organised criminals, multinational enterprises, let's not forget those little beauties, bring with them as well, is a loss of legitimacy and a loss of power. And therefore the debilitating impact of transnational crime alone, without factoring in terrorism at the moment, upon the governance of fragile states is becoming abundantly clear. The net effect, of course, that all of the global regulatory architecture that we try and put in, banking architecture, government systems, etc., simply are too weak to have any effect. And what we see most recently is exploitation by terrorist organisations of that economic meltdown created and facilitated by organised criminals. The notion of convergence, of course, has been around for a long time, but it was given voice most effectively and most prominently by the UN Security Council in September 2001 after the event we all know well. The close connection between international terrorism and transnational organised crime, illicit drugs, money laundering, illegal arms trafficking, and the illegal movement of nuclear, biological and other potentially deadly materials was noted with concern by the UN. Now, after 9/11, of course, particularly driven by the United States, we had a massive targeting of what was thought to be the financing of terrorism through Waladars, Fai Chen, Hundi, money dealers, which of course, evidentially, has never really been shown beyond a few examples. But of course, in targeting the terrorism, there was a systematic freezing of assets, and more importantly, for a great source of funding through the alternative remittance sector, blocking financial transactions carried out by those associated with, or in the American terms, thought to be associated with, but not necessarily proven, terrorists. And once you try and curb the fundraising activities of any organised group, if there is a marketplace involved, where it's a terrorist group or an organised crime group, terrorist groups naturally evolve. And they evolved creating their own financing stratagems, including engaging in organised crime activity. Now, the most obvious aspect of this interconnection between organised crime and terrorist groups is simply a functional one. It just simply works for them at that point in time. There's nothing more romantic or systematic a connection than that. The implication, of course, is that organised crime groups have offered in some jurisdictions their services for terrorists by engaging in criminal activity on their behalf and then financing of terrorism from the proceeds, or some of the proceeds, of that organised crime. So we've got a convergence created by similar logistical and operational requirements, and a number of synergies produced by their sharing of a common infrastructure, so runways and small light aircraft, logistical corridors where, for example, organised criminals' illicit trade routes over the decades have paved the way through corruption and bribery for a safe rite of passage. Safe havens, primarily in fragile states, but also in certain aspects of South American countries, and of course the financial money laundering networks and the expertise that organised criminals have built up, again, over decades, which terrorist groups have not hitherto had to rely too heavily upon. Allied to that also, we have the increased use of the information threat sector. So you'll be aware of recruitment, propaganda, manifested by terrorist groups through the internet. There's also a systematic target information by organised criminals, such that the FBI have noted a systematic structure, not in terms of people on the ground, in terms of people in the ether, controlling the creation of malicious software, the abstraction of information, and the running of the marketplace through social networking sites in particular. And because they have made that one of their target packages, the terrorists are able to come in on the back of that, particularly the creation of the dark web, and also manifest their reputations that way. Now, we know, as I've already mentioned, that terrorist groups have recognized quite quickly, particularly social media, the addiction that certain generations around the world have of doing the two-thumb tango, notifying everybody what they're doing at that precise moment in time, where your self-worth is dictated by how many friends you have on Facebook rather than how many friends would come around and talk to you, means that, of course, cyber departments, so-called, within terrorist organisations, will use that information superhighway not only to find new sources of revenue, but also to identify customers for illicit products they might have control of in certain provinces around the world, such as oil, human beings, arts and antiquities. Terrorists, of course, can also recruit people to join their organisations, and we also have criminals turned terrorists who bring their underworld connections to bear to the group in question. In terms of South Asia, the most logical corridor for this sort of convergence is the Afghanistan, Pakistan or AFPAK sector. The characteristics for what you need to have a strong connection between terrorism and organised crime, of course, are writ large. You have a failed state and you have governed, again in inverted commas, by warlords, militias and other violent non-state actors over quite a period of time. There are allegations, I put it no stronger than that, of Pakistan affording safe haven to a number of terrorist groups, including QST, Haqqani Network and LET, and the TTP terrorist group, of course, fairly active and regarded as gaining some of their funding activities to prosecute their war against Pakistani state through their reliance on criminal acts they themselves have engendered, created and run. There is, of course, as in many fragile states, in terms of corruption and poverty generally, a coincidence of a geographical context and the opportunity space of criminals and terrorists. Level of corruption incredibly high, always have been, despite the best efforts of the Afghanistan anti-corruption organisation. A friend of mine works for them. Very porous borders, and the rule of law I mentioned in relation to fragile states, weak or non-existent. And typically, a lot of the old-style South American type activities have grown large within those particular jurisdictions because they have the manpower and the control over enough territory to actually perpetrate these sorts of crimes. You have the same sort of thing in the former Soviet Union, where organised crime groups focused on the crime that they could commit within their border-bound republic. And so we see the same pattern emerging in South Asia. So kidnapping for ransom, the Haqqani Network operating along the AFPAK border, kidnap Afghans and foreign nationals, TTP extending their activities to major cities, including Karachi, which you wouldn't have thought they would have gone down a few years ago, focusing on abductions of businessmen and entrepreneurs. We did have a guy in the UK who went to Nigeria once to collect his £2 million personally, and was probably kidnapped, ransomed, and had all of his money stolen. So sometimes people can be taken in. Drug trafficking, of course. Now, as you'll know, with the UN and other, the World Drug Report, for example, the UNHRC report from America, these drug tallies vary quite considerably. But based on crop seizures, this is a broadly accurate, and it varies, of course, depending on the yield per year. The Taliban maintains a surplus annually of between 110 and 130 million. They're not, of course, in such dire straits as Daesh are, although Daesh, of course, are moving more into criminal activity to counteract that. And, of course, the Taliban famously over the past decades have stopped cultivation completely, or in a quite a canny move, suppressed the cultivation of the poppy seeds in Afghanistan for a period, and managed to push up the price of their stored opium tenfold. So that's lateral thinking on a scale which most law enforcement agencies don't engage in. And then the Haqqani Network thought to be involved in procurement of the precursor chemicals necessary for creating heroin. So again, they're not relying upon outside agencies to supply, but taking the actions into their own hands, that they're in a better position to defend their territory, their financial wherewithal, if the West comes calling, which I'm sure it will do, as soon as we get Syria off the table. So a few years yet. Extortion and taxation, again, this is a victim of geographical circumstance. Lots of opportunities for criminals and terrorists to finance organisations. The illicit networks allow them to engage in particular nodes within the supply chain. So, for example, simply imposing taxes on trucks that come through, UN badged or not, collecting security payments or protection money in old parlance that you get in any part of London. $100 million collected from the Islamic tax levied on local businesses and farms, like a tithe. And then very banal but effective targeting of communications masts and saying to the telecommunication company that you won't kidnap their employees. Given that Afghanistan's trying to build up infrastructure, the ability to communicate across and beyond the borders is obviously important enough for people to pay that money. Now, Pakistan, of course, has always been a major transshipment country and a lucrative consumer market in of itself. We're now seeing heroin from Afghanistan going directly into Iran via Pakistan and Turkmenistan, and then forming part of the Iran-Turkey-Balkan route rather than going through the north, through Central Asia. And again, that's just reacting to circumstances and taking more of the money into their own hands. There have been assertions, again, no more strongly than that, connections between the TTP and drug trafficking, and an allegation of involvement in heroin distribution abroad, including into Europe. And if you can remember that schematic from one of the very first slides, most movement of illicit goods do resonate in Western Europe. We are the biggest buyers, and that's the saddest thing about all of this. South Asia and other jurisdictions could be ripped asunder if overly rich Westerns didn't spend their money on illicit products and don't think about the consequences. And the criminal activity, of course, a whole range of things: smuggling of drugs and weapons in Balochistan, illegal timber mining in Chitral, exploitation of extractive industries such as marble in Balochistan as well. And that, with a minute to spare, which is pure luck, not judgment, I'll leave it there for now. Thank you.